But I still would like to make a comment on this graph that I think is maybe very risky. And I will share an experience that I had when I was at Bell Labs in the 1980s or 1990s. It was a tough time, where all our managers were telling us, guys, we have made too many discoveries, stop, let's try to move to development. We have enough technology, don't keep going. So I think the CEO of companies has to be careful when you see a graph like that, and should not badly interpret it. And so anyway, there has been a question about nuclear energy, and I think we are going to have an exciting session about nuclear energy with two well-renowned speakers. And nuclear energy, again, people have been contesting quite a lot, but at the last COP28, we need to recognize that some 20 countries have agreed to triple the nuclear energy until 2050. So the two speakers, we have Dr. Paul Nevitt, who spent more or less all his life on this topic of nuclear. He even started his PhD doing already some kind of research on actinide surface chemistry. And then he is presently the Science and Technology Director in the UK National Nuclear Laboratories. Prior to this, he has been Director of the UK Advanced Fuel Cycle Programs. And even before, he has been, in this case, Technical Advisor within the Nuclear Innovation and Research Office and of UK, in this case, dealing with the government and giving advices. So we are excited, more or less, to listen what he has to tell us and what is the vision of UK regarding nuclear energy. So it's a pleasure.
Well, thank you, and thank you for the invite to come and talk. And it was good to hear the questions around nuclear. I would have liked to have seen a chart on the third energy revolution of being the harnessing the power of the atom, because I think we need to recognise that as a step forward. So I'm going to give you a bit of an overview, and I have the pleasure of a bit of a double act with Yves Bréchet. So it's a pleasure and a privilege to talk here in Paris. And the heritage of nuclear in both the UK and France is something we should be proud of, and probably more proud than we are going forward. But before we go into some of the detail, I'll give a bit of an overview, and we'll ask some questions as we go forward. Some basics: you'll hear me talk about reactors and power stations. Just so we're all on the same page, when we're talking about reactor, it's the energy from the fuel, the little red bit on the left side. Generally, we then use a coolant to take that energy to generate steam, the blue bit, and largely currently to generate electricity in a power station. One of the questions going forward, and I'll pose today, is are we getting the most out of the atom and out of the fuel, and should we be using the heat more than we are, and not just electricity? But the key thing with nuclear is not to forget the fuel cycle, and it's a really important part. I know Yves will pick up on a number of that, but when people talk about potentially the long-term sustainability of nuclear, they talk about uranium resources, the fuel cycle. Can we recycle fuel? Can we use it more effectively? So you sort of think of the two parts as we go forward. Jean-Marie mentioned COP28, and it's a really significant moment of being part of the nuclear sector. Anyone that has attended a COP or been part of the process will note that nuclear has been conspicuous by its absence. And for the first time, nuclear was written in at the end of this COP28, specifically in the wording of the technologies we need to accelerate to help us in order to mitigate the effects of climate change. And I think it's an important part. There's still questions, and I know questions within the EU around the taxonomy, and is nuclear green? Is it low carbon? There's still many people across the world that won't recognise nuclear as a low carbon energy. So this is a significant moment, as we go forward across the world, as we've got incredible challenges to decarbonise the energy system. If we rule out a technology, it will be even harder to do that. In the UK, Brexit was not great. On the upside, we're writing our own taxonomy rather than the EU taxonomy. Taking a lot of the EU taxonomy, but one of the key things was, and this is out for consultation, but nuclear will be a sustainable technology. This is really, really important because accessing finance is really important, and finance and how we finance particularly large projects is important. But I'd also point as one of the things that, if you're not aware of, but the beauty of nuclear is the energy density. It's a beautiful, beautiful thing, and land use means that we can generate large amounts of energy from very small amounts of land. If you think a large reactor is about the size of this room and will power millions and millions of homes, it's incredibly efficient. A uranium fuel pellet, millions of them in a reactor, but the size of your thumbnail is the same energy as a ton of coal. So, harnessing that in the right way surely has to be good for humanity as we go forward. So, Jean-Marie mentioned the commitment from 20 countries to triple the amount of nuclear energy. That will only take us to the level that we currently are, which is about 10% of global electricity is generated from nuclear energy at the moment. So that will maintain around about 10% of global electricity, and the UK and France were both part of that commitment, which is really good. It needs detail behind it. It's high-level statements at the moment, so it needs real detail to underpin that. And remember, this is largely looking at electricity, and we will electrify to decarbonise, but there are parts of society that we won't electrify, and I'll mention that. So the opportunities for nuclear are beyond electrification. So where are we today? Just so everyone's, again, up to speed in terms of the global situation. About 10% of electricity production, 400 gigawatt across the world. The second bullet is interesting, particularly from the UK and France, currently embarking on new build programs, but generally in the West and Central Europe, been a decline in nuclear with an increase in China and wider Asia. We talk about technology a lot. And the majority of the nuclear reactors worldwide are light water, water-cooled, taking the energy away. But we have got other technologies. In the UK, the GCR, the gas-cooled reactors. So there are other technologies around. And whoever will listen, I will say that deploying nuclear is not a technology challenge. It's really not a technology challenge. There are technology opportunities and innovation, but deploying nuclear is not a technology challenge at the moment. Really interesting point about innovation. Doesn't necessarily mean new technology. Huge amounts of innovation in getting the most out of our current operating reactor systems. We now have about 80% capacity factor worldwide, so 80% of the time it's operating, which is really important. That's gone up, and huge amounts of research have gone into materials, fuels, operation, chemistry, in order to allow us to do that. And one of the reasons we need to keep deploying light water reactors is because of all of this to go forward and take forward. The other thing is construction, and people will say nuclear is slow. Yes, and the quote is, when was the best time to build nuclear? Yeah, a decade or so ago, but the second best is now, because we're going to need that energy to decarbonise by 2050, but we're going to need energy beyond 2050. But the other thing to take from this chart is that nuclear is being built on time to cost around the world currently. So you will hear negative stories, but you will hear also around the world, particularly in China, in the UAE, deploying nuclear to time and cost. So it goes back to some of what Kai was saying around the wider challenges around deploying technology. In the UK, where are we? Well, not great, if I'm honest, in terms of nuclear. So we've committed to build up to 24 gigawatt new nuclear in the UK. And we've published a roadmap, and you can read all the text. I'll go through that in a minute. But on the right-hand side, there's just a snapshot. This was taken on Sunday afternoon. The orange block on the bar chart, the top left, is the current nuclear in the UK. So around 6 gigawatt current capacity in the UK, with around, actual generation was around 2.5 gigawatt, which was due to, there's currently reactor refueling and currently a couple of reactors off with steam valve issues. You can see dominated by the green, wind, and it was really windy on Sunday. It was Storm Isha in the UK, so really windy. But the red bar is really important, and if you look at the red bar on the charts on the far right-hand side will show you that the orange is the steady nuclear baseload or firm power at the bottom, and the red, filling in the gaps of when the renewable generation is available, is gas. So we are heavily dependent upon gas within the UK. So what are we doing with government? It's been the most pro-nuclear government we've had for a long time. Recognition, we've committed to build beyond more large reactors, aiming to build between 3 and 7 gigawatt every 5 years from 2030. We're going to have to look at siting. The current sites available for nuclear won't allow to that level. Fuel and fuel cycle, so HALEU, high assay, low enriched uranium, which for those outside of the sector won't mean much, but for some of the more advanced reactors, we need slightly higher enriched uranium because of the nature of those technologies, and the supply of that currently outside of Russia is zero. So the UK is committed to build new, and the other bit was you'll see a £9 million investment in my laboratory in one of the Uranics Innovation Centre. And it's linked to the bottom point with skills. We are desperate to rebuild skills. We've not built nuclear for a long time. Investing in new skills is really important. So that's one of the key investments from government. So that's kind of the landscape of where we are in the UK and worldwide. I now want to kind of pose some questions to you. We talked about the future of the energy system, how it's going to change. It's going to look very different, and nuclear being built into the future energy systems. The nuclear can provide electrons, can provide that electric into that future energy system. The low carbon generation with carbon capture, high penetration of renewables, synthetic fuels, hydrogen production. But what about if we use it to the full potential and we add in the heat? And I think that's the key for me going forward, is beyond electricity, how are we going to optimize the use of what currently is largely waste from a nuclear reactor in terms of that energy? Can it improve the efficiency of hydrogen production, high temperature steam electrolysis, for example? Can it be providing district heating as it has around the world? Can it be used directly into industrial processes to optimize those going forward? It's really important to do that and to look at that. But to do that, nuclear has to be part of the full system assessments as we go forward. And I raised some challenges we had in a UK context, that the role of nuclear was only for electricity and it was only for large reactors, not new reactors. And policy was being generated that way, mainly because it was the full system energy models that weren't putting nuclear in as an option. So clearly it wasn't coming out in the solutions. So one of the things to be cautious of is to understand what's the assumptions going in to the full system models. And because if the model isn't offered that input, you're not going to get that output. So we undertook with the Energy Systems Catapult in the UK a full energy system model. So the Energy System Catapult take the information from all technologies, from renewables, from carbon capture, from others, and they pull the latest information together on a full system, not just electricity, full system model. And we modeled to net zero in 2050. But what we did this time, for the first time in the UK, and to some extent globally, in a full system model, was provided the option to have generation 4 or advanced systems providing hydrogen, direct heat to industry and district heat, and the production of synthetic fuels. And what you see, not going into the detail of the results, but the complexity of decarbonising the energy system is just huge. Getting to a decarbonised energy system in the UK needs every single tool. So having nuclear, having more options, gives you that flexibility, makes it easier. If I orientate you on the results, on the left-hand side, the yellow bar is the overall grid size, and the green is the amount of nuclear within that system. You can achieve net zero without nuclear in the UK, but it is incredibly complex. It is reliant upon speculative technologies that are yet to be matured, and it is more expensive because of the complexity of the system. But I can't stand here and say you can't provide a solution without nuclear. You can. However, increasing amounts of nuclear with the flexibility to provide heat as well, reduces the cost of the overall system, and it produces that overall system cost, a lower system cost. And what we see is, in the middle one, if you don't restrict to the available sites, it will deploy beyond 24 gigawatts in the UK. And I believe if we get the policy environment right and plan our energy system right, nuclear will play a role beyond the 20 gigawatt. But there's a lot that has to fall into place. And the chart on the right just says majority electricity, but it does contribute, along with other technologies, to production of hydrogen and district heat. So just very quickly on the role beyond electricity and what the UK is doing. So talked about advanced systems. So generally in the UK, we describe advanced systems as non-light water cooled systems. And the UK has run a program called its Advanced Modular Reactor Demonstration Program. And this is to demonstrate by the early 2030s the ability to provide heat from an advanced reactor system to industry. And one of the good things that the government did do in this was narrow down the technologies. So it's asked for one specific technology, and I'll talk about why they did that. But the complexity of what's coming forward in the UK and internationally from a reactor perspective does get complicated for policymakers, and they wanted to focus down on a technology. They chose high temperature gas reactor, and they did it by a kind of multi-criteria analysis, with the important things being the bits highlighted in red. What can deploy soonest, and what has the temperatures that the industries that they were targeting might need in terms of output temperatures. So high temperature gas reactors can go above 700 degrees C, whereas current light water reactor is about 300 degrees C. Very quickly, you can see in terms of the assessment of why that from a kind of ticking all the boxes of need. What that doesn't solve is the wider challenge, and anyone that's read the news will have heard for today in the UK that the Hinkley Point C, the latest large reactor, is delayed by another 2 or 3 years. So that the challenge of deploying projects doesn't solve this. But in terms of a down selection of a technology, we will look to deploy a high temperature gas reactor to provide heat to industry by the early 2030s and build. Importantly, we need to build and demonstrate these technologies. The other bit I wanted to highlight is the role of Horizon, the Euratom funding. And we are working in the UK. This is a program under the Euratom program called Gemini 4. We're working with, this is led by colleagues with Framatome. We're working with them to look to deploy a high temperature gas reactor, looking to produce industrial steam to be actually located in a Polish research institute. And that again is looking to deploy by the end of this decade. But yeah, a relief to be back in Horizon. Unfortunately, the complication of not being Euratom is somewhat frustrating, but we are still engaging with colleagues in France to drive forward the collaboration. Where will these high temperature reactors be located and why, and what's the opportunity? This gives you an idea of potential of where we are looking at siting. So this is in the northeast of the UK. Hartlepool already has an existing advanced gas reactor in the top right-hand side, but you can see the cluster of industry already around that region. So if we can put back in an energy source that is low carbon, can provide electricity and heat, can we support the decarbonising? Can we maintain the economic impact and benefit in those regions of the northeast? And regionally, in terms of social acceptance, we find locations that existing reactors sit really want new nuclear in their regions. So a couple of last slides. I think the role for nuclear in the energy park concept needs to be considered, but these roles can only come to part. You know, let's look at it from the basic. Nuclear will provide you with heat. That's what it will do. How do you harness that low carbon heat? If we get it right, it should help us in all of these areas. But the important bit to leave, I have 3 questions, and I will quote Professor Sir David Mackay, former Chief Scientific Advisor to UK Government, who written a wonderful book, Sustainable Energy Without the Hot Air. And he said, whatever happens, you need a plan that adds up. And I couldn't agree more. So we need to understand what the system looks like. The first bit, what's the role within that system? The second bit, and Yves will talk a bit about this, is do we have the resources? Do we understand the fuel cycle? How are we going to fuel it? And then what's your plan to deliver those technologies? We did this as part of what we call the Advanced Fuel Cycle Programme in the UK to start to look and provide that information into government. But it is those 3 steps that are really important. I'll finish that with where we started, because I think it's really important now, if there is consensus that we need to accelerate the deployment of low carbon and low emission technologies, including nuclear, then we need to get together to work out how we do that. So I'll stop there, and I'll hand over to Yves to talk a bit more about the concepts going forward. But thank you again for the opportunity to talk.
Thanks, Paul, for the very nice presentations. I think we don't have a question now. We are going to wait the presentation of Yves Bréchet. So Yves, for my French colleagues, I don't need to present him, because everyone knows him. He's our reference on nuclear energy. But for the French or for the English colleague, I think Yves has done a large amount of work in France in nuclear energy. He has been part or act as a commissaire of the energy atomique CA, and is actually head of the research direction at Saint-Gobain. And he has been acting, I think, in a lot of groups, companies in France as an advisor. And I think Yves is also an outstanding scientist, especially a material scientist, where he has been studying the physical properties, especially the mechanical properties of different metals, the metallurgy, and he's certainly one of the first, at least, to develop very strongly all the modeling parts. And he's also very interested in architecture material and bio-inspiration, so he's a Bible in the field of materials. So, Yves, you can do it.
Thank you very much for the introduction. It's a pleasure to join this meeting, and it's a pleasure to have this meeting jointly between UK and France. Because I think we did have many difficulties to coordinate ourselves with Paul, because obviously you'll see, I hope, that the approaches are very complementary. So, the outline of the presentation will be the following. I will start, as usual, when I'm giving a lecture in Collège de France, by the big picture. Then I will try to speak to you about the standard nuclear reactors, and most of the nuclear reactors which are operating, and most of the ones which are being built are PWR reactors, means reactor of pressurized water. Then I'll come to the point that was alluded to. What do we mean by sustainable nuclear energy? And that will bring me to the question of the fast breeders, and I will end with some concluding remarks. Now, the big picture. I mean, you'll see it's really a big picture, but I think that's worth having all these kinds in mind. If you look at the energy sources, you have a number of them: solar, wind, mechanical, I mean, being a horse which is dragging things, hydropower, coal, gas, and nuclear. The ones which are in red are the ones which have a very low CO2 emission. The ones which are in red and I don't know, how do you say? But in bold red, hydro and nuclear are the ones on which you have the control of. That means that you can decide to run them or not run them, which is not the case with the sun. It's difficult to decide that the sun is going to be there. It's not the case with the wind. Now, second part of the big picture, it's even bigger. You have to keep in mind that in order to produce oh, sorry, I forgot. There was the energy sources, but there is also the energy vectors. So I have listed 3 of them. There is electricity, heat, and hydrogen. Electricity and heat are almost opposite. Electricity is difficult to store and easy to transport. Heat is difficult to transport and easy to store. And hydrogen, depending if you are in favor of or if you are allergic to hydrogen, you would say it's equally good or equally bad in both. In terms of the energy usage, I'll just make it in very big picture again. You have usage for industry, usage for housing, usage for transport. We have come over the years to such a selfishness and a forgetful of the need of producing things in our societies that most of the mix which are proposed to you are proposed so that you can feel good as an individual. You need energy not only as an individual, you need energy in a large quantity well centralized in order to operate on industries. Now I go to the next big picture. In order to produce, transport, and use energy, we have to make stuff. Stuff being energy production, cable, pipes, storage device, manufactured goods. In order to make stuff, you need space, energy, and raw materials. And in order to make stuff in a sustainable manner, you need sustainability of resources, measure the impact on environment, and look at the contribution to global warming. And if there is one message beyond nuclear energy that I would put on the table, I think as long as we are not taking into account the whole picture, we are finding fake solutions. Now, I'm going to talk about the standard nuclear energy, the PWR. So I'm going to start by this picture here. If you look at the CO2 emission of the various sources of energy, there is the one whose name shall not be pronounced. I'm a big fan of Harry Potter. That's Voldemort. For years, it was almost impossible to talk about nuclear energy, including in the GEC. Now, one point which is important that we start to realize that it's a low CO2 emission for our electricity. Now, we have a number of classical concerns. Knowing the time I have to speak to you, I'm not going to go to all these concerns. I'm ready to discuss with you about what is behind, but basically, it was born in the ghost of the atomic bomb. It was inflated death from an invisible enemy, radiation. If you just look at the number of people death per kilowatt hour produced, that's probably one of the lowest quantity that you have for nuclear energy. One standard nonsense is that we don't know how to practice decommissioning. I mean, just look what has been going on Earth. Look at the number of plants which are being decommissioned, which are already being decommissioned. I even wrote a book on that. But it seems that just giving the fact is not enough to kill a lie. We don't know how to deal with the waste. That's again untrue. We know how to deal with the waste. The amount of waste we have to deal with is small, and the way you can store the waste in, for instance, the solution that we have in France, but there are different solutions in Sweden, which is to put them into glass, put the glass into a casting, put the casting under a layer of clay, and that's the geology which is doing the job. So just saying we don't know how to deal with the waste is a lie. If we say that there is not enough uranium and the limited resources create a dependence, that's true. And I will come back to that. It is more and more expensive, that's true. We have to look why it is getting more and more expensive. And I completely agree with Paul has said. It's not a question of technical deployment, it's a question of industrial structure. We no longer know how to construct a plant. That's partially true for the very simple reason that we have not been doing it during 20 years. So if you don't build and you just operate, that means that you are losing the competence, but you can rebuild the competence. Now, the need for political stability is essential and not guaranteed, and I think that's exactly true, and that's something for political scientists and historians. If you have an unstable political regime, that's a problem for nuclear energy. Now, if I look at the waste, if you look at the high activity, long life nuclear waste, so here these various cubes give you the original fuel. In the original fuel, after 3 years, you have fission products, minor actinides and plutonium. The fission products are relatively short term, minor actinides are long term, plutonium is long term. But you see the number of kilograms which are there are pretty small. And if you look at the way you store them, after 100,000 years, you know it's long. That means it's a time scale which is not the time scale of an engineer, that's a time scale of geology. After 100,000 years, the amount of radioactivity which goes up out of the ground is something which is exactly at the level of the radioactivity of the ground. Now, another aspect that Paul alluded to, which I think is important, if this is a diagram which is due to Václav Smil, I strongly recommend reading two people in this field. One is Václav Smil, and the other one is David McKay. David McKay's that was quoted before. Here you have the area and you have the power density. In blue, you have the power density of the nuclear core, but that's not fair. I mean, you don't have a nuclear core which is sitting on your table. It has a whole bunch of concrete around. But what it tells you is that one thing which is very important is that the density of energy in nuclear energy is just enormous. And the reason is quite simple, that you are playing with the binding inside the nucleus. The binding between the nucleons is much, much stronger than the binding of electrons to atoms. So that means that the density of energy you are going to get in nuclear power is by nature going to be much higher than any other source of energy. Now, the density of matter which is used is also something very important. I mean, you need a low quantity of matter to operate a nuclear power plant. By matter, I don't mean the fuel, I mean everything which goes around, the concrete, the steel, and so on. And again, that's because of the density of energy produced that you don't need big things to make big quantity of energy, big power. You have big things in nuclear reactor, but they give you an enormous power compared to a similar structure. And if you look simply the tons of steel in terms of normalized by the megawatt produced, I think you have a factor 20. You go from 20 to something like 800 if you are going from nuclear to a solar plant. So that's again something important. It's not using a lot of matter. And the matter it's using for fuel is basically useless. Cannot do anything with uranium except producing energy. Now, what is nuclear energy? Again, I'm not going to give you a course of nuclear physics, but basically it's a whole question of neutron economy. So the neutron economy, which is the thing which is going to tell you how many atoms are going to be fissioned during a chain reaction, is going to depend on the fuel, it's going to depend on the geometry of the assemblies, and the moderator to slow down the neutrons, I'll come back to that, on the absorption of excess neutrons. The evolution of the element will mean how many fission products do we have, how many actinides, how many plutonium do I have created, and you have the question of extracting the heat, either to use it as heat or to run a turbine in order to produce electricity. So my summary of what is nuclear energy is basically a neutron grocery shop, which is coupled with a steam engine. And that's the reason for which it developed so rapidly, because we were relying on 150 years of steam engines. Now, if you look at that, the grocery shop is related to the fuel, and it's connected to the waste. Now, from this very simple picture, you are going to question how can I secure the resource, how can I limit the waste? So that will be the thing which will make nuclear energy sustainable. In terms of electricity and heat generation, you are back to the 19th century. But that's a technology which is available. Now, as Paul said, there are many nuclear reactors. I like this diagram, which is a sort of phylogenetic tree of all the possible reactors. But in fact, there is one which is largely dominant on Earth, on the current situation, which is the pressure water reactors. And I'm just going to talk in the rest of the presentation of the PWR, because the question we have is to build them, but also to manage the way they are aging. And I'm going to talk about the fast neutron reactors, because that's the one which is imposed if you want to have a sustainable nuclear energy. Now, if I go to this picture, basically in the design, you need to do thermohydraulics and neutronics. You need to dimension and do material selection. The construction needs to make forging, welding, civil engineering, and that's the place where we are losing time. That's the place where there is an incredible cost. The problem is not in the nuclear part. The problem is the way you make the things. And the problem, by the way, is also a problem which is not only for nuclear. It's visible for nuclear. But it's basically the signature that Europe has been steadily destroying its industry during the last 30 years. If we go at the operation, we need to argue about the fuel fabrication, the cladding, the component replacement, the corrosion, the aging, and the radiation. Now, I'm just going to give you a picture just to frighten you. That's the kind of questions that people who are looking at the aging of nuclear reactor have to deal with. I mean, it's going to be inside an aggressive or relatively aggressive liquid, which is water, boiling water or hot water. Your materials are basically, most of their materials are steels, and you have to cope with mechanical loading, irradiation, temperature, environment, and the ultimate goal, the ultimate nightmare is then when you have stress corrosion cracking assisted by irradiation. That's going to keep metallurgists busy for quite a while. But all these things are under control because the nuclear reactor are permanently controlled. You have a regular visit of the nuclear reactor, and then when you notice there is something wrong, stop it and change. Now, one idea which I think is very important is the idea of the technological readiness level and the strategies of decision which goes with that. If we look at the technologies, there are the technologies which are available, there are the prototype technologies, there are the breakthrough technologies. The technologies available are to be implemented now. The technologies prototype, they have to be industrialized tomorrow, and the breakthrough technologies, they have to be explored and researched to be impulsed now. Now, the point is that in the first category, you have the PWR, and you have a number of these small reactors. In the second technology, the prototype technology, you have the fast breeders reactors, which are relying on the uranium-plutonium cycle. And the last one are the fusion reactors or the molten salt reactors. And it's very important to face the time scale. We have now to do something. We have been procrastinating doing things during 20 years. Now the question of global warming drives the decision of making things now, which means that we have to do that with available technologies. Now, I come back to my last point, which is towards sustainable nuclear energy. And you'll see why I mean sustainable. So the classical fuel cycle, which is the one which is operating in France, is basically you take uranium, that means that you have to mine it, you make your fuel, you put your fuel inside the reactor, it lasts 3 years, and you go back, and then it could become a waste, or when we stupidly decided in 1998 to stop superphénix, there was a sort of surrogate which appeared, which was the box, which is basically you make a second term, but it's becoming a real nightmare, so you just stop there and then go to the storage. Now, if we look at the classical cycle, that's where the SMR, AMR are appearing. And I just want to put some words here. Beyond the small is beautiful. I mean, it's interesting not simply because it is small. It is small, that means that you have a lower initial capex, that you have, therefore, a higher cost for a similar power. That's something you have to live with. Then you have to ask, am I ready to afford that? There is passive safety and design simplicity, which is a very good point when you have to rebuild things. The enrichment should balance the increased neutron loss. In your grocery shop, if you have a small reactor, the boundary of the reactor are closer. So that means that you have to balance the loss of neutrons that you have here to have it work efficiently. It's in principle constructible off-site, to be done. And I think the key issue, which we are very seldom asking and which the UK has been asking, is when is it relevant? We are in a situation in France where we keep on talking about small reactors without asking what for. So the reason for which they are relevant, it can be on industrial sites which need heat or electricity far from the grid. It can be relevant on islands. It can be relevant for heating of cities, provided you have the network for heat transportation. It can be relevant for desalination. I think we are in a situation where before jumping into something which is small, therefore beautiful, we should argue why we want to go there. Now, I just want to quote you this wonderful statement by Retrouvez about the difference between the academic reactor and the real reactor. So the academic reactor is always working very nicely on paper, never has any problem. It's supposed to be cheap, rapidly constructed, and so on. And the real reactor, it's being built now. It is behind schedule. It is requiring an immense amount of development and apparently trivial item. It's corrosion, for instance. It is very expensive. It takes a long time to build because the engineering development problem. It is large and it is heavy and it is complicated. This guy is not nobody. This guy has been ruling the nuclear propulsion in the United States during 60 years. So he knew what it was to build something. And I think this should be on the table for anybody who wants to launch a program. Now, need for a better use of uranium resources, why? Well, look where they come from. Currently, the main providers of uranium are Kazakhstan, Niger, Canada, and Australia. I let you guess which are the ones on which I feel more happy with and which are the ones I would like to avoid. Now, the second point is that we have been hearing that we have to multiply by 3 the amount of nuclear energy. Interestingly, the guy who said that is also the one who stopped nuclear fast breeders in France. Okay. If nuclear energy increases within the world by 2% per year, the uranium resources from standard mining will be almost consumed by 2050. That doesn't mean that you couldn't find more, but that means they will be much more expensive. Nobody can claim for sure that nuclear energy is a transient solution. Under many solutions, under many political decisions, there is this unsaid belief that we have to live with nuclear energy, but it's only a transient. There is no proof of that, and I wouldn't like my country or any country to take the risk of jumping out of a plane hoping that the parachute will be ready when I reach the ground. For reason of sovereignty, there is a need for sustainable nuclear energy for the very reason I told you. Now, sustainable nuclear energy, it's another cycle. It's multi-recycling in a fast breeder scheme. That means that the uranium that you go into your cycle is going to produce plutonium. You have some of the uranium which is not usable, and the plutonium, you just put it back with the impoverished uranium, and you do it again and again and again. And that means that basically with all the 300,000 tons of impoverished uranium we have in France, you have something like 2,000 years of resources without needing mining. Not surprisingly, the people who are doing mining are not so happy with this idea. Not surprisingly, the people who don't like nuclear energy are not happy with that. And that's exactly why this thing, which is the cornerstone of a nuclear renewable, of a sustainable nuclear energy, was the target of anybody who wanted to get rid of nuclear energy. Now, where does it come from? It's not new. It comes back to the wisdom of Fermi. The wisdom of Fermi, and that's the 2 slides I'm going to give you, that's the only nuclear physics I will tell you, is that if you look at fissile elements, they can go nuclear fission by neutron bombardment of any energy. And the one which is able to do that is mainly uranium-235, which is 0.7% of the natural uranium. That's why it tells you that the use of uranium we are making in standard PWR is poor. Only 0.7% of natural uranium is used. Then you have the fertile elements, which can become fissile by capturing a neutron. That's the case of the plutonium, created by U-238, U-233, created by thorium. The neutrons created by fission are fast, and they can't break efficiently the U-235. In order to be efficient, they have to be slowed down. And the slowing down in the PWR is water. The water is both slowing down the neutrons and extracting the heat. If you look at these thermal neutrons, which have been slowed down, they have also another aspect which is less pleasant, is that the absorption increases, which means that you are creating long-life waste, the actinides, and you are creating plutonium. Okay, now the fissile plutonium can be separated, reincorporated into a fuel, and that's the MOX strategy. Now, the problem is that the MOX is going, if it's going through neutrons which are slow, which are thermal neutrons, the MOX is going to be more and more polluted by actinides. So that's why it's something which is difficult to deal with after one circle. Now, the key idea is that either neutrons are not slowed down, they are fast neutrons, the Pu-239 is not degraded, and the uranium-238 generated plutonium. The fuel made of plutonium and uranium, which uranium-238, which is useless if it's with the standard neutrons, can be used in a fast breeder mode. It can either create more plutonium or isogenerator mode. have the same amount of plutonium produced. The main goal of the fast neutron reactor is to burn the uranium-238, which is the impoverished uranium, which is the one which is useless, and the one which is the most frequent one. Now, but it doesn't create actinides. In order to keep the neutron fast, they have to bounce back on heavy atoms, and the water is excluded. That's why you are using molten salt or molten sodium in order to do that. Now, the idea of fast neutron reactors dates from Fermi as well as the first construction of the atomic reactor. Now, just to make a simple picture, if you take a match, the plutonium is the phosphorus at the end of the match, and the uranium-238 is the wood of the match. So you just light the match, you eat the uranium-238. The interesting thing is that it's a permanent match, because you recreate plutonium. So it's just a match that you could light up again and again and again in order to burn the wood that you have in huge quantity compared to the uranium-238 that you have in small quantities. Now, if I look at the various options, if you compare just the last line between the PWR, the standard PWR, and the fast breeders, basically instead of creating transuraniums by something like 30 kilograms and 27 kilograms of plutonium, you take only 4 kilograms of transuranium, 0 kilogram of plutonium unused. So the plutonium is used as a resource. If you look at the line of the percentage of uranium which has been used, the fissile material, only 62% are unused in the PWR, while 0.1% are unused in the fast breeders. That comes to my concluding remarks. The assets of nuclear energy for decarbonizing economy, I think it's fair to say it's a mature industrial field with potential for innovation. It makes an efficient use of resource and space and matter. It's amenable to an easy integration into existing networks. It goes to a dense electricity production or for a dense electricity usage. It's responsible. This industry has developed a responsible management of the whole life cycle, in spite of what is said. If you look at the SMR, AMR, there is a need to analyze the technical issues and the economical relevance, but provided you do that, there are possible developments. The strategy for a better use of fuel, fast breeders for sustainable nuclear energy. That needs, in any case, a long-term commitment in a politically stable environment. All the words have been weighted. And it needs, for collaboration between countries, then one of the reasons for which I'm so happy to see UK and France talking together again on these topics. Thank you very much for your attention.